She called his dog disgusting. Then it saved her daughter. The lobby of the Grand Horizon Hotel did not smell of the city outside. It was a filtered, heavily curated atmosphere, smelling faintly of imported white cedar, dry linen, and the cold, sharp scent of absolute, untouchable prestige. The floor was a vast expanse of gray, mirror-polished Macedonian marble, so clean that if you looked down, you saw your own silhouette moving beneath your feet like a dark ghost drowning in frozen water. Under the high-set clinical spotlights, the guests at the grand reopening gala moved in slow, expensive circles, their diamond jewelry and silk-lined suits catching the light like shards of polished glass. Luke Carter stood near the service entrance, his large, calloused hands resting on the handle of a heavy metal utility cart. He wore a faded, standard-issue gray maintenance uniform that was slightly too large for his lean frame. His boots were scuffed, the leather dark with old wax, carrying the honest dust of a long morning spent in the building's deeper, less glamorous mechanics. At 39, the silver creeping through his temples and the deep weathered lines around his eyes suggested a man who had lived through several lifetimes in the dark. Beside his boots, resting on her haunches, was Shadow. The old German shepherd was a fragile, gray-muzzled silhouette against the sparkling white marble. Her coat was worn, scarred along the left shoulder from a search and rescue mission in a collapsed mining shaft years ago, and her breathing was a slow, slightly wheezy rhythm that rose and fell with the patient dignity of a creature who had seen too much of life to be startled by the noise of the rich. "Stay close, girl," Luke whispered, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate from his chest. It was the only sound the dog trusted. Tucked behind the reception desk's marble counter, sitting quietly on a low stool, was 6-year-old Toby. He was wearing a wool sweater 2 sizes too big for him, his small fingers meticulously turning the pages of an old hand-drawn atlas. Every few moments he would look over at Shadow, and a silent, secret language would pass between them, a look of absolute, unwavering certainty. To Toby, the old dog wasn't just a pet. She was the anchor that kept their small, broken family from being swept away by the current of a city that didn't care about those who fell off the ledge. The revolving glass doors at the center of the lobby turned with a mechanical, expensive hiss. Miranda Reed stepped into the cathedral she had built. Even before the employees saw her face, they reacted to her presence instinctively. Security guards straightened their spines. Receptionists lowered their voices to a whisper. The sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of Miranda's designer heels echoed across the marble floor like a flurry of small, precise gunshots. She was 36, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, high-polished bun that left no room for softness on her aristocratic features. Her white Alexander McQueen pantsuit was immaculate, tailored so perfectly it seemed to repel the dust of the lobby floor. Miranda did not look at people. She appraised them. In her arithmetic, a person's value was determined entirely by their social standing and the depth of their portfolio. Wealth had taught her how to buy obedience, but it had long ago stripped her of the ability to recognize human dignity. Beside her walked her daughter, Sophia. Unlike her mother, Sophia looked fragile. She was 8, with pale skin, quiet eyes, and a soft pink cashmere scarf wrapped around her neck. Her eyes wandered curiously across the giant lobby, eventually stopping on the corner where Shadow sat. "Miranda," the lead security chief, a man named Henderson, murmured, stepping into her path with a deferential bow. "The board members are waiting in the mezzanine. The signing is scheduled for 10 a.m. Miranda gave a single, clinical nod. "Make sure the press is positioned correctly. I want the transition of the property to look seamless." She turned her head to look at the grand staircase, and that was when her gaze landed on Luke. Specifically, her eyes landed on the scarred, gray-muzzled German shepherd resting beside his scuffed boots. A small flicker of irritation tightened Miranda's jaw, a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated disgust that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She walked toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, a cloud of sandalwood perfume moving with her like an invisible wall of status. "Mr. Carter," Miranda said, her voice a low, polished rasp that carried the chill of a winter morning. She didn't look at Luke's face. She only looked at the old dog's scarred shoulder. I believe the employee handbook was quite clear about the presence of animals in the public spaces of this hotel. Luke stood his ground, his broad frame creating a sudden, uncomfortable density in the room. He didn't look at the floor. He looked directly into her cold blue eyes. She's a retired canine, Ms. Reed. She has a medical waiver to stay with me during the transition shift. She stays quiet. Most guests never even notice her. Miranda let out a dry, theatrical laugh. It was a sound that had no joy in it, only the cruelty of the highborn. A medical waiver? Miranda sneered, her lip curling as she looked at the silver hairs on the black floor. This is the Grand Horizon, not a shelter. This animal looks disgusting. It's scarred, it's shedding, and it smells of damp wool and the street. She turned her gaze to Sophia, who had stepped away from her handler and was now reaching out a small hand toward the dog. Sophia, don't touch that, Miranda snapped, her voice like a cold blade cutting through the silence of the lobby. It's dirty. It might carry diseases. Toby, watching from his stool behind the desk, felt his throat tighten. He looked at the white suit of the CEO, then at the floor where the white confetti of his father's dignity lay scattered. She's not dirty, Toby whispered from the corner, his voice small but clear in the suffocating silence. She saved people. Miranda's cold blue eyes flicked to the little boy, then back to Luke. Her expression hardened with visible annoyance. Security, she said coldly, not raising her voice but ensuring her command carried to every corner of the room. Remove this animal from my building immediately, and see to it that Mr. Carter's credentials are deactivated by the end of his shift. We are in the business of luxury, not charity. The hands of the security guard, clad in heavy black tactical nylon, did not touch Luke's shoulder. They hovered just inches away, a silent threat of physical force that the upscale clientele of the Grand Horizon preferred to remain invisible. Luke did not wait for the hand to close. He slowly released his grip on the handle of his utility cart, his large knuckles turning a pale, bloodless white against the steel. "We are leaving, Toby," Luke said quietly. His voice didn't rise, but the low, grounding frequency of it made the two guards step back a fraction of an inch. He didn't look at Miranda Reed. He didn't look at the board members who were already returning to their quiet, expensive conversations, their laughter resuming like water flowing back over a cleared stone. Luke knelt beside Shadow. The old dog's ears twitched when his hand brushed the scarred patch on her shoulder. "Up, girl," he murmured. Shadow stood with a slow, deliberate effort. Her hind legs, stiffened by years of damp winter searches and the cold concrete of old rescue sites, trembled for a brief second before she stabilized herself. She did not whimper. She kept her head aligned with Luke's hip, her gray muzzle pointed toward the glass exit. Toby slid off his stool behind the reception desk, his small hand clutching his school bag. He walked to his father's side, his boots making a soft, hollow sound on the Macedonian marble. He didn't cry. He had lived through enough of his father's silent departures to know that in these rooms, tears were just another currency they couldn't afford to waste. As they pushed through the gold-rimmed revolving doors, the warmth of the lobby was instantly replaced by the biting gray reality of a New York autumn. The rain didn't fall, it misted, a freezing, salt-laden fog that rolled off the East River and clung to the brick of the warehouse blocks. Luke guided his family toward his rusted 2008 pickup truck parked in the far corner of the service lot. The vehicle was a physical insult to the line of pristine black executive town cars idling near the curb. Its fenders were gray with road salt, and the engine turned over with a heavy, rattling protest that sounded like a machine arguing with the cold. Inside the cab, the heater blew a thin, lukewarm draft that smelled of old copper and wet dog. Toby sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the small silver compass he had pulled from his bag, the last of his mother's belongings. "Did the lady think Shadow was bad, Daddy?" Toby asked, his voice small against the rumble of the engine. Luke adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes catching the dark, towering glass of the Grand Horizon rising into the gray sky like a silver needle. The lady doesn't know how to look at things that aren't polished, Toby. She thinks if something has a scar, it's broken. But she's wrong. Things that survive usually carry marks. He reached out and rested his palm on the old dog's head. Shadow let out a soft, wheezy sigh, her chin resting on the console between them. Behind them, the glass tower loomed, silent and immaculate. But the air inside the executive suite was already starting to lose its tension. 40 floors above the wet pavement, Miranda Reed stood at the head of the redwood table, her pen hovering over the final page of the merger agreement. Her fingers were steady, the diamond on her ring catching the cold light of the recessed LEDs. "The security grid is 70% integrated," Marcus, her CFO, said, his voice a smooth baritone as he scrolled through his tablet. "By midnight, the automated lockouts will be live across all 40 floors. No more manual patrols. We are becoming a closed loop." "And the lower levels?" Miranda asked without looking up. "The parking garage and the utility vaults are already offline to non-essential staff," Marcus replied. "We've cut the maintenance budget by 20%. The automated sensors will handle the climate and safety routes." Miranda signed her name, a sharp, angular signature that looked like a weapon. "Good. I want this building functioning like a watch, quiet, expensive, and completely predictable." She didn't notice that her daughter, Sophia, had drifted away from the executive assistant near the door. Sophia was 8, and her world was a collection of silent rooms and people who spoke to her mother's tablet rather than her face. She had been staring at the pink cashmere scarf around her neck, her fingers tracing the soft wool. She remembered the old dog in the lobby. She remembered the way the dog's amber eyes had looked at her, not with the polite, managed indifference of the hotel staff, but with a deep, silent recognition. Sophia walked out of the boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind her with a soft, hydraulic sigh.
The hallway was empty, a long, white tunnel of brushed steel and gray carpet. She didn't want to go back to the boardroom. She wanted to find the dog. She walked toward the service elevators, her small designer shoes making no sound against the thick wool runner. Down in the subterranean levels of the parking garage, the world was different. The gray concrete walls were damp, smelling of old rubber, wet dirt, and the heavy, stagnant air of a space that sat 30 feet below the river line. The lights here were sparse, flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed with a low-frequency vibration that made the teeth ache. Luke stood by the open bed of his truck, packing his tool bag. His contract was officially terminated, his access card already deactivated in the hotel's central system. He had exactly 10 minutes to clear his locker before the automated gates locked him out of the lower level forever. "Toby," Luke said, his voice quiet, "stay in the cab, I'll be back in 2 minutes." "Back." "Okay, Dad," the boy whispered, his eyes still fixed on the silver compass. Shadow stood by the open door of the truck, her nose twitching. She didn't look at the tool bag. She looked toward the dark, echoing expanse of level B4, the deepest, coldest level of the garage, where the massive water mains and high-voltage transformers lived. A low, vibrating hum began to move through the concrete floor. It wasn't the sound of an engine. It was the sound of a system losing its alignment. Up in the boardroom, the digital displays on the wall suddenly flickered. The bright green stock tickers turned into a jagged line of purple static. "Marcus," Miranda said, her voice dropping its polished veneer. "What is that?" Before Marcus could answer, the lights in the boardroom went out. Not just the lights, but the entire building. The hum of the high-efficiency HVAC died instantly. The smart locks on every door clicked into the closed position. The glass tower was suddenly plunged into an unnatural, terrifying twilight. "The backup generators," Marcus stammered in the dark, his voice high and thin. They aren't engaging. The automated grid is completely dead." Miranda Reed stood in the dark, her fingers freezing around her gold-leafed pen. The white Alexander McQueen suit she wore was no longer a symbol of power. In the suffocating silence of the 40-floor tomb, she realized she couldn't even open the door to her own office without a digital signal. But down on level B4, the silence was already broken. Sophia had reached the lower level just as the grid failed. The elevator had stopped 3 feet above the concrete floor, the doors sliding open with a heavy manual groan before the backup safety locks engaged, trapping her in the dark. The emergency latch released with a mechanical groan, leaving a narrow gap just wide enough for Sophia to squeeze through, her small shoes slipping on the wet concrete. The air here was freezing, smelling of rust and cold water. "Mom!" she called out, her voice a small, terrified whisper that was instantly swallowed by the vast concrete labyrinth. There was no answer, only the low-frequency hum of a ruptured water main somewhere in the dark, and the sound of cold water beginning to pool around her ankles. And if you still believe that a father's silent resolve and the instincts of a forgotten hero are the only things that can guide us through the dark, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories of justice that the world wants to bury.
The darkness inside the stairwell of the Grand Horizon was a dry, hollow thing. It smelled of raw plaster, settled dust, and the sudden, cold sweat of 90 executives who had forgotten how to navigate a world that didn't respond to a touchscreen. Miranda Reed's designer heels, those high-end black leather pumps that usually commanded the corridors of her 80-story empire, made a frantic, uneven sound against the stone. She didn't walk, she scrambled. Her pristine white Alexander McQueen suit was already creased at the waist, her perfect high-polished bun beginning to unravel, a few loose blonde strands sticking to her damp temple. Her hand, usually so steady on multi-billion-dollar contracts, trembled violently as she gripped the cold iron railing of the 40-story stairwell. "The elevator shafts are dead weight, Miranda," Marcus Draken whispered. He was leaning against the concrete wall 5 steps above her, his silk tie loosened, his collar damp with the heat that was rapidly rising from the lower levels. The HVAC had been dead for 40 minutes, and the air was already growing thick, hot, and heavy. "We have 50 high-definition cameras on the lower levels," Miranda hissed, her voice a sharp, jagged reed that cut through the darkness. "Why can't your security team tell me where she is?" "They run on the cloud, Ms. Reed," Henderson, the security chief, said from the shadows below, his voice high and thin. He was holding his dead tablet like a shield, his fingers tapping uselessly against the black glass. "The ionization from the solar surge has scrambled the receiver arrays. The building, it has no memory. It has no eyes. We are blind." Some people measured human worth entirely through price tags, believing that a luxury badge could buy safety from the cold and the dark. But in the deep quiet of a total grid failure, the price tags fade, and the only currency that matters is the quiet competence of those who know how to work with their hands. At that moment, nobody in that dark stairwell realized that the old, silver-muzzled German shepherd they had violently ejected from the lobby was the only entity in the entire 40-story tower that didn't need a Wi-Fi signal to see or a digital map to find a child. Down on level B4, 30 feet beneath the riverbed, the water was rising. The rupture in the primary main was not a leak. It was a steady gray torrent that hissed as it poured over the high-voltage transformers. The air was freezing, smelling of wet concrete, rusted iron, and the low mechanical hum of copper wires under extreme tension. Sophia was huddled inside a narrow concrete alcove, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her skin a translucent, sickly pale under the yellow halogen light of the emergency indicator that had faded to a dull glow. Her pink velvet trousers were soaked in dark, greasy water. Her pink cashmere scarf, the one her mother had adjusted so severe and straight, had slipped into the rising tide, floating like a drowned flower in the gray silt. "Mom?" she called out again, her voice a small, broken whimper that was instantly swallowed by the vast, concrete labyrinth. There was no answer, only the low-frequency hum of a ruptured water main somewhere in the dark, and the sound of cold water beginning to pool around her ankles. At the other end of the garage, Luke stood by the open bed of his truck, packing his tool bag. The headlights of his 2008 pickup were the only light on the entire sublevel, casting long, wavering shadows across the concrete pillars. Toby sat in the cab, his face pressed against the glass, the silver compass in his hand reflecting the dim yellow glow of the dashboard. Luke had his bag packed. He had 2 minutes before his deactivation window closed, and the security gates sealed him in the basement forever. But Shadow did not move toward the truck. The old German shepherd stood at the edge of the headlight beam, her nose lifted, her gray muzzle twitching in the cold draft. Her ears, scarred and torn from years of rescue work, were pinned back. She let out a low, vibrating rumble from deep within her chest, a sound Luke had heard only in the ruins of collapsed buildings. "Shadow, what is it?" Luke whispered, his hand instantly finding the heavy flashlight on his belt. The dog did not bark. She took 3 slow, deliberate steps into the darkness of level B4, her paws making a wet, sloshing sound in the rising water. She stopped, turned her head back to Luke, and let out a single, sharp huff. Luke followed the beam of his flashlight. At the edge of the concrete ramp, floating in 3 inches of greasy water, was a wet, pink cashmere scarf. He knelt, picking it up. The wool was soft, expensive, and smelled of lavender and the artificial sweetness of sugar, the exact scent of the little girl who had reached out to touch Shadow in the lobby. He felt his chest tighten, his hand clenched around the wet wool. He looked at Toby in the cab. "Toby, lock the doors. Stay with the heater. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, you blow the horn, understand?" "I understand, Dad," the boy whispered, his eyes wide behind his glasses. Luke turned his flashlight toward the black, echoing labyrinth of the sub-basement. He looked at Shadow, whose gray muzzle was already pointed toward the deepest, coldest corner of the vault. "Find her, girl," Luke whispered. The old dog didn't hesitate. She stepped into the freezing water, her stiff joints forgotten as her rescue instinct took over, leading the way into the blind dark where no machine could follow. The freezing water on level B4 was black, oil-slicked, and held the distinct chemical taste of stagnant industrial runoff. It had already swallowed the lower half of the concrete pillars, making them look like a forest of gray, sunken trunks in an underground swamp. The only light came from the narrow, cutting beam of Luke's heavy brass flashlight. It sliced through the wet darkness, illuminating floating cardboard, empty plastic bottles, and the shimmering, rainbow sheen of motor oil on the surface. Shadow moved ahead of him, her silver-gray belly deep in the flood. Her breath came in short, white warmth that drifted away into the cold, concrete vaults. She didn't splash. She walked with a slow, deliberate stride, her front paws feeling the invisible obstacles beneath the water before her weight shifted. But Luke could see the micro-tremors in her hind legs. The cold was a cruel knife, cutting straight into the arthritis that had settled into her hips after a lifetime of carrying her weight through collapsed buildings and freezing mountain runs. Every step she took was a choice to ignore the pain, a decision made entirely by the ancient, unbending circuitry of her training. "Easy, girl," Luke whispered, his voice a low, steady rumble that kept the silence of the vault from closing in. He didn't use the flashlight to scan the ceiling or the distant walls. He kept the beam fixed on Shadow's ears. In the dark, those ears were his only instrument. They were pinned back, twitching to the left, then to the right, filtering the chaotic echoes of the underground. The hum of the water main was a constant, low-frequency roar, but beneath it, the old dog was listening for something else, something small, something that carried a heartbeat. The air grew thicker, smelling of copper and the sharp, burning scent of sulfur. Up ahead, a secondary transformer box hung from the concrete wall, its steel door rusted open. A thick bundle of black cables, as wide as a man's wrist, had slipped into the water. Every few seconds, a brilliant blue-white spark would hiss across the wet concrete, illuminating the damp concrete vaults with a violent synthetic flash before plunging them back into the dark. It was a silent, lethal barrier. One step in the wrong direction, one touch of the charged water, and the current would find the shortest path to the earth through their bones. Shadow stopped at the edge of the blue-white flash. Her body went rigid, her tail lowering. She didn't bark, she knew the rules of the dark, but her jaw tightened, a low rumble vibrating in her chest. Luke knelt in the water, his boots soaking through, the coldness of the river-slicked concrete hitting his knees like a physical blow. He shone the flashlight at the cables. The current was arcing across a 3-foot gap of flooded floor. There was no way around it. The concrete wall on the right was smooth, wet with condensation, offering no handholds. "Toby!" Luke roared, his voice a low, heavy engine that cut through the metallic hiss of the vault. Blow the horn, now! In the dark, 3 sublevels above, the sharp, percussive blast of the truck's horn echoed down the concrete ramps. The sound was a physical hand breaking the paralyzing fear that had settled over the dark basement. Luke didn't try to pull his steel crowbar free from his tool bag. He let go of the metal handle. He grabbed the heavy, thick canvas strap of his bag, wrapping it twice around the metal bar to act as a crude, non-conductive insulator. He put his entire weight into the canvas, his boots slipping on the wet concrete, his jaw setting into a hard, rigid line as his muscles strained against the dead weight of the locked utility door. The electronic magnetic lock gave way with a sound like a pistol shot. The massive steel door swung open, the bottom edge scraping a deep white groove into the wet concrete. At that exact microsecond, the junction box exploded. It wasn't a fire, it was a blinding blue-white arc of raw energy that hissed as it struck the wet floor. The air was filled with the smell of vaporized copper and scorched insulation. The high-voltage current surged through the abandoned crowbar, the steel turning a momentary cherry red in the dark before the master circuit breaker on the street level blew, plunging the basement back into an absolute dead silence. Luke didn't wait for the steam to clear. He reached into the dark alcove, his large, scarred arms wrapping around Sophia. She was shivering violently, her skin translucent under the light of his flashlight, her pink cashmere scarf lost somewhere in the black water. He lifted her against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder, her breath a shallow, ragged gasp against his neck. "Shadow, let's go," Luke said. The old German shepherd stood with a slow, visible effort, her left hind leg dragging slightly as the cold water took its toll on her stiff joints. She didn't whimper. She kept her head aligned with his hip, her gray muzzle pointed toward the concrete ramp that led to the upper levels. In the main lobby, the darkness was still absolute, but the silence had been replaced by the chaotic murmur of emergency personnel. The heavy glass doors had been manual locked, and 2 firemen were using a hydraulic spreader to force them open. Miranda Reed stood near the security desk. Her white Alexander McQueen suit was no longer immaculate. It was creased, stained with soot from her descent through the fire stairs, and her high-polished bun had completely unraveled, a few blonde strands sticking to her wet temple. She was clutching her leather bag as if it were a shield against the reality that her wealth couldn't buy her daughter back from the dark. "The thermal cameras are offline, Ms. Reed," Henderson, her security chief, said, his voice a flat, empty rasp. "The basement levels are a dead zone. We have no way of knowing—" "The dog," a quiet voice said from the entrance. It was General Samuel Holt, the head of the Regional Rescue Command, who had arrived with the emergency services. He wasn't looking at Miranda. He was looking at the glass doors that had just popped open with a heavy hydraulic hiss. Through the steam of the lobby's dying climate control, a silhouette emerged. Luke walked onto the polished Macedonian marble. He was carrying Sophia against his broad chest, his faded gray maintenance uniform soaked in black water, his boots leaving wet, heavy prints on the pristine stone. Beside his hip, limping but unyielding, walked Shadow, her gray muzzle dripping, her eyes fixed on the entrance. Miranda let out a sound, not a cry but a broken, jagged sob that made the board members look at the floor. She ran across the lobby, her designer heels clicking frantically, and fell to her knees on the cold marble, her hands reaching for her daughter. "Sophia," she choked out. Luke stood still. He didn't hand the girl over immediately. He looked down at the billionaire CEO kneeling in the dirt of her own lobby, her white suit ruined, her power gone. He looked at her with a profound, chilling pity. "She was in the utility vault on B4, Luke said, his voice a low, steady rumble that silenced the entire lobby. "The water was rising. Your smart locks had failed in the closed position." He set Sophia down gently. The girl didn't run to her mother. She stood there, her pink velvet trousers soaked in grease, her small hand still clutching Shadow's thick neck. General Holt stepped forward, his eyes locked on Luke's face. He didn't look at the uniform. He looked at the scars on his hands, then at the old German shepherd's torn shoulder. "Luke Carter?" the general whispered, his voice trembling with a respect that no amount of money could buy. The Luke Carter? The lead handler from the 2018 Appalachian Rescue? We thought you had retired after the crash." "I was just performing maintenance, General," Luke said quietly, his eyes drifting toward the service door where Toby was waiting, in the shadows. Miranda Reed stood up slowly, her fingers trembling as she wiped the soot from her face. She looked at Luke, then at the old, scarred dog she had called disgusting only 2 hours ago. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice losing its polished executive edge. "I'll write a check. 50,000? 100? I'll give you the head of our global security division. Please, tell me what you want." Luke looked at her. He looked at the gold-leafed pen sticking out of her ruined blazer. "You still don't get it, do you, Miranda?" Luke said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the lobby. "You think everything is a transaction. You think you can buy back the dignity you tried to take from me. You think money can fix a heart that you treated like a liability." He turned to the exit, taking Toby's hand. Sophia didn't follow her mother. She stood on the marble, her hand resting on the broken handle of her pink scarf. She looked up at Miranda, her blue eyes wide, carrying the weight of a final, devastating question. "Mom?" the little girl asked, her voice clear and chillingly cold in the absolute silence of the lobby. "If he's poor, why was he the only brave person here?" Miranda Reed stood in the center of her glass tower, her mouth slightly parted, and for the first time in her life, the silence was complete. The silence that followed Sophia's question was not a temporary pause. It was the heavy, structural collapse of an entire life's work. Miranda Reed's hand slowly dropped from her daughter's shoulder. Her manicured fingers, which had signed $20 billion mergers without a single vibration of doubt, now shaking so violently that her gold-plated pen slipped from her pocket and clattered against the cold marble, looking small and absurd in the dirty gray water. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the old, gray-muzzled German shepherd whose head was still resting against Sophia's wet velvet trousers. And for the first time in 36 years, the CEO of the Horizon Group found the absolute limit of what her money could buy. "The federal safety inspectors are already on their way, Ms. Reed," General Holt said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp of finality. He didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with the deep, professional disappointment of a man who had seen too many structures collapse because the people at the top forgot to check the foundation. "My team's preliminary review of your internal maintenance logs shows a 20% reduction in safety patrols on the lower levels. You locked the manual overrides to save on the aesthetic of the walls." The general turned his back on her, his heavy boots making a firm, rhythmic sound on the marble as he walked toward the emergency exit. "Miranda," he added over his shoulder, "your company will be facing a federal investigation for criminal negligence before the sun rises. I suggest you find some lawyers who know how to work in the dark, because your lights aren't coming back on anytime soon." The collapse of the Horizon Group was not slow. It happened the way structural failures always happen, invisibly, behind the plaster, for a very long time, and then all at once in a single second of noise. Within a month, the grand glass tower of the Grand Horizon was shuttered, its gold-rimmed revolving doors wrapped in yellow police tape, the name Horizon chiseled off the brushed steel plate beside the entrance. The board was dissolved, the stocks hit near zero. But down in a quiet, wooded valley 20 miles north of the city, the world moved at its own analog pace. The Claire Carter Search and Rescue Foundation occupied a low, one-story cabin made of unpeeled cedar logs. The air inside always smelled of dry pine, leather wax, and the warm, earthy scent of wood smoke. It wasn't designed to impress investors. It was built to last. Luke sat at a simple redwood desk, his large, calloused hands steady as he reviewed a topographic map of the Adirondacks. He was wearing his old flannel shirt and his worn work boots, no longer a ghost in a blue jumpsuit, but a man who owned his own time. On the floor beside his desk, resting on a thick wool blanket in the warmth of the hearth, lay Shadow. Her gray muzzle was tucked under her paws, her breathing a slow, rhythmic, and perfectly balanced purr. Her hind legs still carried the stiffness of her years, but the cold water of B4 was a distant memory now, replaced by the steady heat of the cedar fire. The door of the cabin pushed open with a soft, expensive hum. It was Miranda. She wasn't wearing her white Alexander McQueen suit or her designer heels. She wore a simple gray wool sweater, her dark hair no longer in a severe bun, but falling loosely around her shoulders. She looked smaller, her face lined with the deep, tired wisdom of a person who had finally stopped looking at her reflection and started looking at the earth. She stood on the threshold, her hands in her pockets, watching Toby show Sophia how to use the silver compass at the kitchen table. "The legal proceedings are finished, Luke," Miranda said quietly, her voice losing its cold, polished rasp. "The board has been dissolved. I've signed over my remaining personal shares to the foundation. It's 60 million. For the rescue teams, for the training." Luke didn't look at her checkbook. He didn't look at the document she held out. He stood up slowly, his broad frame casting a long, warm shadow across the wooden floor. "I don't need your millions, Miranda," Luke said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "The children in this valley need handlers who know how to read the wind, not how to write a tax write-off." Miranda bowed her head. A single, honest tear fell onto the cedar floorboards, disappearing into the dust. "I know," she whispered. "I'm not here to buy anything. I'm here to ask if you'd let me volunteer. For the maintenance, for the cleaning, just the stuff that matters." Luke looked at her. He looked at her boots, now covered in the gray mud of the forest path. He saw the change in her, the raw, unshielded humanity that only arrives when you have lost everything worth protecting and realized that leaving is the only way to survive. He didn't offer her a corner office. He didn't offer her a title. "The firewood needs splitting," Luke said quietly, pointing toward the axe by the door. "And the dog's blanket needs washing. If you're ready to get your hands dirty, you can start there." Miranda smiled. It wasn't the negotiated, sharp smile of the boardroom. It was a real, soft, and slightly bittersweet thing. "I'm ready," she said. She took her coat off, hung it on the heavy timber rack by the door, and walked out into the woods where the trees stood tall and silent, untroubled by the stock prices or the glass towers, rooted in the deep dirt that had been there from the beginning. Sophia walked to the doorway, watching her mother pick up the split wood. She looked at Toby, then down at the old German shepherd who had opened her amber eyes to watch the wind. "My mom's suit is dirty," Sophia whispered to Toby, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "I like her better this way." "Me too," Toby said, holding his mother's silver compass. "It always finds its way back." True power is not the ability to command 40 floors of glass or order the removal of those who do not shine. True power is the quiet competence to know your worth when the world is calling you a ghost. It is the character to mend what others break, and the grace to forgive when the world finally kneels at your feet. In the end, the tower of glass was gone, and the forest remained. And as the sunset painted the silver peaks in gold, the three of them, the father, the son, and the old dog, stood on the threshold, watching the light sweep across the valley, guiding the lost back to the ground where they belonged.